Thersites the historian here. Like most of you who are history buffs, I also have a soft spot for World War II. It's something that I've been reading about on and off since I was a teenager. And the thing that has really interested me has not necessarily been the actions of the major powers, but rather how minor powers have played into the grand narrative. The little strands that smaller actors have managed to weave into a larger tapestry. So today I'd like to talk about Portugal and Portuguese neutrality during the war. Let's take a look at Portugal on the map here. Now we see that the Portuguese Empire was still intact in 1939. They still held a lot of valuable real estate. They held the Azores and the Atlantic, which was a strategic location between the Americas and Europe. They held 2 colonies in Africa. They held a little bit of land in India. And they also held 2 colonies in the Pacific that were in the direct path of the Japanese conquest. So how is it, given all of this, that Portugal was able to successfully avoid getting dragged into a war? If I had to answer the question in a single word, the word I would choose would be necessity. Portugal simply was far too weak to get involved in World War II without suffering catastrophic damage that would have eliminated its small empire. From 1910 to 1926, Portugal was in a state of chaos. In 1926, there was a revolution pictured here, and that resulted in the installation of a dictator. That dictator's name was Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Salazar was brought into the Portuguese government in 1928 as the Minister of Finance, and by 1929, using strong-arm tactics, he managed to balance the budget. Now, economic dogma at the time was all about balancing budgets to fix economies. That actually doesn't really work. However, that was what people thought was effective at the time, and Salazar himself was actually a professor of economics prior to his joining the government. Now, 4 years later, in 1932, Salazar became the Prime Minister of Portugal, and he used that position to establish a dictatorship that would last until 1974, even though he himself died, I believe, in 1968. Salazar dubbed his new administration the Estado Novo, or New State. The New State was a corporatist regime dedicated to economic growth. It was all about industrialization and infrastructural improvement, and it more or less was a partnership of Salazar's government with the Catholic Church and with corporations to monopolize power and prevent things like labor organization or individual liberty from taking off in Portugal. In other words, Salazar was a fascist dictator of the Benito Mussolini or Francisco Franco variety. That's not to say that he was like Hitler, because clearly there is a difference to be made between someone like a Salazar and someone like a Hitler in terms of brutality and terribleness. However, he is not exactly what we would normally think of as a good guy. That being said, he did do a few positive things. When he first took power as Prime Minister, the illiteracy rate in Portugal was somewhere around 68%. That is the number of people who could not read. And by about the time of Salazar's death, he had about a 97% literacy rate. So progress was made under Salazar, but it did come at a heavy price for individuals who would like to be free, or laborers who would like to, say, have workplace safety or decent wages. In 1939, Salazar commissioned the Monument to Discoveries in Lisbon, which was a memorial to Portugal's Catholic past and also to Portugal's role in the Age of Exploration as one of the major powers in exploring the world and making innovations in navigation. As you will recall your world history, Ferdinand Magellan, of course, was Portuguese, and he is the first person, or at least his crew were the first people, to circumnavigate the globe. And basically what he's trying to do is to draw in Portugal's past with the present. He's trying to revive this kind of fervent Catholicism that he himself feels and use that as a tool to control his populace. He had a lot of support at this time from the Pope, who, if you'll recall from your prior knowledge of World War II, was not really that big of an enemy to fascism in general and had a fairly soft attitude towards what Hitler was doing. So if you see someone like Salazar, who isn't killing people in droves, is an ardent Catholic, and is anti-modern in terms of his views on personal freedoms, if you're the Pope, you'd be pretty happy with that. The same year, in 1939, Salazar proudly described his state as anti-parliamentarian, anti-democratic, and anti-liberal. And if you think about all the things that this monument could potentially stand for, with that big cross on the front and trying to relate Catholicism in that medieval crusading sense with discovery and innovation and sort of technocratic excellence that he thought that he himself would personify in the Estado Novo, you can really see how Salazar was indeed the epitome of a fascist, even if he is not of the Hitler variety. Militarily, Portugal didn't have much to work with in the 1930s and 40s. They had 16 regiments of infantry. There were the Portuguese equivalent of the brown shirts, which were men of all ages, some of whom were over 60 years old. And they also were starting to form their first armored units. So let's take a look at some of the weapons that they have, and we can see how Portugal was not an advanced industrialized nation and how they had to avoid combat at all cost. This is a Beretta machine gun, Beretta with a D, and it was developed in Italy, and it was used by the Portuguese and Italians, so this was basically something they relied on Italy to get. Obviously, Italy had other concerns in World War II, so if they needed more, well, good luck. According to this gun collector on YouTube, Germany manufactured some of its bolt-action K98 rifles for Portuguese use, but ended up canceling a large percentage of those orders because, well, it had its own wars to fight, and therefore decided to keep the rifles that it was producing. Here are some Portuguese artillery pieces from the period. They're really not all that impressive. These are fairly low caliber weapons. I believe these might be 75mm guns. They weren't exactly outdated, but they weren't really cutting edge either, and they would not have really done much to shred a lot of the modern armies of the 1940s. Here is a Cardin Lloyd tankette designed in 1927. By 1939, this thing was completely and totally unviable and would have been a guaranteed death sentence for anyone unfortunate enough to be in one. This is a British Vickers tank. It's a little more modern, but still not adequate to take on panzers. This thing was undergunned and under-armored. It's not a Matilda, it's not a Churchill. It's not anything that you've probably ever heard of outside of, say, Panzer General, and you take your Vickers units and immediately upgrade them if you know what you're doing in that game at all. Probably the most modern plane in the Portuguese arsenal until at least 1943 was the British Gloucester Gladiator, a biplane which was used still by the British and which was primarily designed for attacking ships. It was somewhat effective in British hands, but the Portuguese only had maybe a dozen of these things, and again, this was their best aircraft. As a biplane, this thing is nowhere near modern by 1939, and it would have been about 100 miles per hour slower than a monoplane fighter. As we alluded to earlier, Portugal was a great naval power at one point in its history, and that's how it acquired its empire. So what kind of fleet did Portugal have in 1939? Well, they had 6 destroyers, 7 avisos, and the ship pictured here is an aviso. It's basically described as something like a sloop or maybe a scout ship. The description that I found is a little vague. Anyway, it's clearly not a capital ship, so it's not like, say, a cruiser or something that can blow another ship out of the water. They had 3 submarines, 3 torpedo boats, 5 gunships, 2 river gunboats, 3 patrol boats, 2 mining ships, 4 survey vessels, 2 support ships, and 2 training ships. In other words, the Portuguese Navy was nothing to take seriously. All of the other powers involved had much heavier and much better ships and way more of them. So the Portuguese Navy was basically just a force that could ferry men and supplies between the different points of its empire. It was nominal at best. Maybe they could deal with the occasional pirate in the South China Sea, but they certainly were no actual threat, and they would not be able to actually defend territories like the Azores from any kind of hostile actions. Back during the Napoleonic Wars, Portugal was able to keep itself safe from Napoleon and his marshals because Portugal had rough terrain, and it had a few brave men in their lines, as well as some British engineers to help fortify the area around Lisbon. So Marshal Massena of the French army actually looked at Lisbon's fortifications and basically turned around and left because he knew there was no taking that. In World War I, had they been invaded, fortifications were king. But World War II, offensive technology was such that fortifications were not going to be sufficient to keep Portugal safe. So all of the deficiencies in equipment that I pointed to earlier are all the more glaring for that. Portugal, if had it been invaded directly, would have had essentially no chance of victory. Given Portugal's extreme weakness and vulnerability, it shouldn't come as a surprise that when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Salazar was deeply worried about its outcome. On the one hand, you had the Republic forces, which were being backed by the USSR, and they were basically somewhere between liberal and communist. Now, Salazar was an ardent anti-communist, and therefore it should come as no surprise that he heavily favored his fellow fascist Francisco Franco. Franco, of course, won the Spanish Civil War, and by 1939, just prior to the outbreak of World War II, he had Spain under his grasp. Now, despite the fact that he and Salazar were both fascist, they weren't necessarily close allies. They both had some distrust for each other, and indeed the other two fascists on the world stage, Hitler and Mussolini. Now, Salazar, for his part, was convinced for a very long time that Franco was going to invade him, so they came to an agreement on March 17, 1939, where they formed the Iberian Pact. However, for several years after that, Salazar was convinced that, just like with the German-Russian Pact, that Franco was biding his time and was going to basically make a dive at Lisbon and conquer all of Portugal in the name of Spanish glory. However, Franco never entertained such ideas, and ultimately the two men would rule side by side for many decades. They both died at old age in the 60s and 70s respectively, and they both have fallen into disrepute, but they both essentially died as honored men who were beloved by NATO, which is kind of ironic given that NATO is supposed to, among other things, oppose tyranny and oppression. At first, Salazar wanted to get directly involved in the Spanish Civil War, but ultimately it was unpopular at home, and he was afraid that Republican sympathizers at home would try to expand the conflict into his country, and of course he was afraid that the communists in the USSR would be eager and willing to try to infect, in his mind, a new country. So all he did was end up sending about 8,000 to 12,000 or so, quote, volunteers into Spain to help. These men were called the Viriatos. They were named after Viriathus, who was a Portuguese, or more technically a Celtiberian chief, who opposed the Roman conquest of the area that would later become Portugal. And later, when Spain sent the Blue Division to the Eastern Front as volunteers to help the Germans, about 160 or so of these Portuguese guys who had fought in the Spanish Civil War went to Russia, and I imagine at least half of them died. By 1940, Hitler had overrun France, and he had established Germany as the dominant power in Europe. Mussolini had joined in on the war effort, and it was basically Germany and Italy versus Britain, with Britain being the power that was clearly losing the war. Now, for Salazar, as someone who had an ancestral alliance with Britain, but who was a fellow fascist with Hitler and Mussolini, this was a point of crisis. Britain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, and they have been allies ever since. This is the longest standing alliance in world history, and Salazar didn't want to break it. Partly for tradition, but also Britain had a good navy at this time, and they could use that navy to essentially snatch Portugal's empire and revenge, and as a way to achieve some victory when victories were eluding them fighting the Germans and even the Italians. So Salazar ultimately tried to plot a middle course. Portugal's strongest asset during the war was that Portugal happened to own the Azores Islands, which were an important geographical location during the Battle of the Atlantic when the British were struggling to stay supplied and the Germans were desperate to stop all shipments to Britain. So Salazar had to try to prevent the Azores from being seized by the much more powerful British. The Germans also had a plan to possibly take over the Azores, but they didn't really have the navy to do it. And the U.S. also drew up a draft plan to seize the Azores. Now, ultimately, the Allies would take the Azores. The British basically invoked the old Treaty of Windsor in 1942 or 43. But in exchange, they agreed to give Portugal things, and this is how Portugal was able to secure itself and make sure that it wouldn't suffer German retaliation for kind of favoring the Allies while remaining neutral. Portugal's policy in East Timor and at Macau was to essentially let the Allies and the Japanese just kind of move through their territory. At one point, the Australians actually seized East Timor and later just repaid Portugal for the use of their facilities. But the Portuguese neither had the strength nor the inclination to fight back, because had they fought back, they would have gotten drawn into a war that they had no ability to win. Recall the previous comments I made about the Portuguese Navy and Army. So if Portugal ultimately let the British lease the Azores, then how did they keep the Germans happy? Well, the answer is simple. Portugal is one of the few places near Germany where you can get tungsten, also known as wolfram, which is a very useful material to have if you're trying to make advanced weapons and armaments. So Portugal basically made a lot of money during the war mining and shipping tungsten to Germany. Now, the Portuguese were under a lot of pressure from the British to not send this tungsten to Germany. And so what Salazar did is he was also shipping tin at the time, so he drastically cut his tin shipment to Hitler while keeping the tungsten shipment about the same. And what this did was show Britain that he was sort of favoring them without making a meaningful stance against Germany. So Hitler waged a formal protest. However, he was getting the thing that he really needed from the Portuguese. He could get tin elsewhere, and he did. So Portugal kind of played the war that way. They managed to keep everyone happy enough without really siding heavily with any one person. During the Azores, one thing I didn't point out when the British took the islands is that the Portuguese refused to allow American personnel to be stationed there unless those American personnel were effectively classified as British. So it created sort of a weird loophole where there were American servicemen serving on the Azores who claimed to be British. The most positive consequence of Portuguese neutrality is that Portugal as a whole, and Lisbon in particular, were able to house refugees fleeing from Hitler's Europe. Many victims of the Holocaust were able to escape this way, and many people were either able to stay in Lisbon during the war, or else they were able to go to, say, the United States, Canada, or Britain, and escape Hitler's Europe that way. In Casablanca, which is still a movie that a lot of people watch, the main characters are actually trying to escape Africa and go to Lisbon to take refuge and escape the war. Lisbon was also a happening place if you were a refugee of high status or someone who had previously held political office. In late 1940, at just the Palace Hotel pictured here, we had the former Premier of Luxembourg, the last Premier of Belgium, the Premier of France, the President of Poland, and the deposed King of Romania, all staying just at this one hotel in Lisbon. Portuguese neutrality and the movement of so many people in and out of Lisbon during this period meant that Lisbon became one of, if not the most important centers for espionage in Europe at this time. Now, because of the way that Lisbon served as this conduit for people moving in and out of the country, the Germans and others would take advantage of this to plant agents in Lisbon and then have them move from there to other places. And Lisbon itself was the home of about 50 or so intelligence agencies. Because of that, Admiral Canaris instructed the Germans not to shoot down planes or sink boats leaving Portugal because he wanted this population to remain fluid so that people and therefore information could just move about freely, and hopefully he could collect some of it and give it to the German war effort. If you're interested in learning more about espionage in Portugal during the war, I recommend you read the book Lisbon by Neil Lockery. It's a great read. I read it a year or two ago, and it's actually what got me interested in this topic in the first place. Moving on. When Portugal and Britain reached an agreement on the Azores and Salazar allowed the British to use the islands as a base to fight German U-boats, that was the turning point for Portugal in the war, and they started more and more heavily favoring the Allies. Part of what they got out of this deal, since they were afraid of alienating the other fascist powers and being attacked, is that Portugal was given quite a bit of military equipment. They got around 100 or so Spitfire fighters from Britain, pictured here, and they also received things like the M4 Sherman tank from America, the M5 Stuart tank, etc. So now if Portugal were to be attacked by one of the Axis powers, or say if Franco randomly decided to attack, Portugal might actually have a chance at defending itself. Under Salazar, the Portuguese continued to deepen their ties with Western Europe after the war. In 1949, Portugal was one of the founding members of NATO. And it is largely because of Salazar's decision to ally Portugal so strongly with the United States and Britain that he lasted for so long and was largely regarded as sort of a hero in the Western press, even though he was more or less the epitome of everything that they declared to be wrong with the world. To try to wrap this up, I would like to sort of share my thoughts about the state of discourse about Salazar, at least so far as I was able to find things while I was trying to research for this video. And what I find really sort of fascinating / disturbing is that there's basically nothing on Salazar in the English language unless you count his Wikipedia entry. I looked at the Ohio State Library listing, and there are very few books about him. The last one that I could find was written in 1970 when he was still alive. From what I can tell, it looks like the press that did cover him was mostly positive, at least the English language coverage of him. And from what little I can gather, I can kind of read a tiny bit of Portuguese because I know things like Latin, French, and Spanish a little bit. It seems like Portuguese people who do discuss Salazar are pretty divided on whether or not he was a good leader. There seems to be some like right-wing conservative types who say that he was very vital for the development of the Portuguese state, and that even if a more liberal regime had been in power, that the Portuguese people really would have only been marginally better off. And then there are those who really decry all of the abuses that Salazar allowed towards individual liberty. I guess I sort of feel like this is a topic that deserves a lot more discussion. This is something that seems relevant to the world we live in. We've had endless discussions about people like Hitler, and we've had endless discussions about the nature of democracy and the balance between, say, freedom and the power of the state. So I feel like Salazar and the things that he did during World War II and later would make a very good case study for exploring things like the relationship between the state and the individual, and really just also looking at what fascism is or isn't. I personally think Salazar qualifies as a fascist based on his rampant corporatism and his strong allegiance with the Catholic Church, but or at least his attempt to relate the state and the church. That's an important distinction. I actually don't care if he's Catholic personally. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point. It's about 3:30 in the morning. I'm a little sleepy. So I'll leave it there. Let me know what you think. Where do you stand on Salazar? Is that something that you'd like to learn more about? Anyway, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will talk to you later when I come up with a different topic to make a video about. Peace.